Chapter 2: The New Science of Hope. People are fed by the food industry, which pays no attention to health, and are healed by the health industry, which pays no attention to food. Wendell Berry, Sex, Economy, Freedom, and Community. Our diet has undergone radical changes in the past century. Born in 1910 and raised in a rural New England farm town, my grandmother ate 2 soft-boiled eggs and buttered toast every morning for breakfast, ground her own hamburger with a medieval-looking device she clamped to the kitchen counter, and kept an old coffee can full of bacon fat by the stove for cooking. By the time she passed away in 1993, all of these foods were falling out of favor with the American public and had been officially condemned as dangerously unhealthy. The first U.S. dietary guidelines, released in 1980, warned that saturated fat and cholesterol caused obesity and heart attacks. So they advised Americans to moderate your use of eggs, limit your intake of butter, and trim excess fat off meats. Food manufacturers sought to capitalize on these new food rules by flooding the market with fat-free sweets and cholesterol-free fats like corn oil, canola oil, and margarine. By blaming modern health epidemics such as obesity, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease on saturated fat and cholesterol, the U.S. dietary guidelines drove us away from nutritious whole foods like meat and eggs and right into the arms of the ultra-processed food industry. Like a perfect storm, the powerful forces of food industrialization, growing anti-meat sentiment, and fat and cholesterol phobia collided and have been feeding on each other for the past 50 years, dramatically transforming our nutritional way of life. Since most other nations patterned their food guidelines after the U.S. guidelines, this shift away from animal fats and toward refined carbohydrates and vegetable oils meant that the whole world was about to take part in a grand nutrition science experiment with devastating consequences. Characterized by an abundance of calorie-dense, nutrient-poor foods and beverages, the so-called standard American diet, I'll take the liberty of referring to this as the SAD diet going forward, isn't just an American problem anymore. This modern atrocity has been exported to all 4 corners of the earth, endangering the physical and mental health of people everywhere. Unfortunately, we don't have much concrete information about the mental health of people prior to the modernization of our diet, but what little we do have suggests that our mental health was more robust in the past than it is today. Industrial globalization has made it difficult to locate people in this century who eat entirely off the land. But in the middle of the last century, there were still pockets of dietary sanity to be found. In a 2003 paper titled Nutrition and Schizophrenia, University of Sheffield psychiatrist Dr. Malcolm Peat highlighted interesting studies from Taiwan, Tonga, Trinidad, Papua New Guinea, Malawi, and Australia's Gold Coast, all of which suggested that schizophrenia was far less common in people who fed themselves by hunting, fishing, and subsistence farming. As Dr. Peat wrote, "It is remarkable that studies of truly indigenous populations are virtually unanimous in reporting very low rates of schizophrenia. For example, signs of schizophrenia were exceedingly rare among non-westernized Pacific Islanders in the 1950s. Of 60,500 inhabitants examined, researchers identified only 2 individuals with psychotic behavior, 0.003%. Whereas the prevalence of psychosis among Europeans of the same time period was 67 times higher, 0.2%. Of course, food isn't the only difference between modern Western ways of life and the lifestyles of these indigenous groups. And observations of this nature don't represent hard evidence of a connection between modern diets and our mental health crisis. Unfortunately, that level of evidence doesn't exist. It's simply food for thought. Perhaps serious mental illnesses don't need to be as common as they have become. Nutritional psychiatry and the Mediterranean diet. A better way forward? The relatively new specialty of nutritional psychiatry was established on the belief that the deterioration in the quality of our diet is largely to blame for the deterioration in our mental health. For the prevention and treatment of depression and other mental health conditions, most thought leaders within this budding field recommend changing from the SAD diet to the Mediterranean diet. Although vaguely and inconsistently defined, the Mediterranean diet has recently been described as being high in whole grains, vegetables, fruit, nuts, legumes, and olive oil, moderate in seafood, poultry, eggs, low-fat dairy, and red wine, and low in sweets, red meat, and processed meats. The story of how the Mediterranean dietary pattern and its familiar whole grains good, animal fats bad philosophy became implanted in our collective psyche is told masterfully by investigative journalist Nina Teicholz in her book, The Big Fat Surprise. Part wishful thinking, part wild guess, the Mediterranean dietary pattern essentially began as a romantic theory about what we should eat, inspired by cherry-picked aspects of cherry-picked Mediterranean traditions, and propped up by unscientific studies conducted in the 1950s and 1960s by Dr. Ansel Keys, a University of Minnesota researcher who believed that saturated fat caused heart disease. We will see what makes studies like his unscientific in Chapter 3. The creators of the Mediterranean diet didn't start with a thoughtful examination of the nutritional risks and benefits of individual foods, use that information to design a dietary pattern, and then test that pattern in human clinical trials to see if it improved health. Instead, they observed that people living in countries along the north shore of the Mediterranean Sea generally seemed to be healthier than Americans, assumed that some of the differences in the way they ate must be responsible for their superior health, and then designed a dietary pattern that they thought represented the healthiest aspects of those culinary traditions. Among the important revelations in Teicholz's book is that Professor Walter Willett, a prominent nutrition researcher who was chairman of the Harvard School of Public Health at the time, prematurely declared the Mediterranean diet to be a healthy eating pattern in 1993, 7 years before the diet would first be tested in human clinical trials. The Mediterranean diet has since been extensively tested in dozens of human clinical trials for physical health conditions such as obesity, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes, and has consistently outperformed the SAD diet, earning the trust of the medical community and nutrition policymakers alike. As for mental health conditions, although studies testing the Mediterranean diet's potential to prevent or treat memory and cognitive health issues have produced mixed results, 3 clinical studies have now demonstrated that switching from a poor quality SAD diet to the Mediterranean diet can improve symptoms of clinical depression when added to standard psychiatric treatment, medication, and/or psychotherapy. The science is clear. The Mediterranean diet is healthier than the SAD diet. So if you currently eat a SAD diet, switching to the Mediterranean diet would be a solid step in the right direction. What makes the Mediterranean diet healthier than the SAD diet? Is it the nuts, the olive oil, the red wine? We really don't know. Those who advocate for the Mediterranean diet speculate that it is superior to the SAD diet because it is lower in saturated fat, trans fats, and added sugars, richer in essential nutrients, higher in fiber, and chock full of colorful fruits and vegetables brimming with phytonutrients, naturally occurring plant chemicals believed to have unique anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. However, there are so many differences between these two dietary patterns that there is no easy way to determine which aspects of the Mediterranean diet are responsible for its health benefits. Almost any change you make to the modern atrocity that is the SAD diet is bound to make it healthier. In other words, just because emerging evidence supports the idea that the Mediterranean diet is better for the brain than the SAD diet doesn't necessarily mean that it is the best diet for the brain. And there are good reasons to suspect that it is not. A few examples. The grains and legumes that form the foundation of the Mediterranean diet are nutrient poor themselves and even contain anti-nutrients that interfere with our ability to access certain essential minerals. The Mediterranean diet frowns on some sources of refined carbohydrate, such as sweets, while celebrating others, such as bread and pasta. The Mediterranean diet encourages the consumption of alcohol. But the Mediterranean diet's biggest blind spot is that it pays far too little attention to metabolic health. In other words, it contains too much carbohydrate for people with insulin resistance to safely process, resulting in higher insulin levels that can damage brain metabolism over time. The word metabolism refers to the complicated collection of chemical reactions our cells use to turn food into energy. Since the brain is an energy hog, if its metabolic machinery can't generate enough power to meet its needs, it can and will malfunction. Metabolic health is the missing link. After decades of standing still, the field of psychiatry is taking a quantum leap forward. A revolutionary new way to think about mental health is changing the way scientists study mental illness, transforming the way psychiatric professionals approach clinical care, and empowering individuals and families to improve their mood, concentration, and memory, often reducing or even eliminating the need for psychiatric medication. The breakthrough realization of our time is that robust metabolic health is essential to robust mental health. Within only the past 5 years or so, an exciting new subspecialty of psychiatry has emerged called metabolic psychiatry. This term was coined by Stanford University psychiatrist Dr. Shivani Sethi, who defines it as a new subspecialty focused on targeting and treating metabolic dysfunction to improve mental health outcomes. Investigators in this field are discovering that what many psychiatric conditions have in common is that the brain has trouble burning glucose for energy. One of the most important obstacles to brain energy flow is insulin resistance, a serious metabolic disorder that is reaching epidemic proportions in many places around the world. Diets too high in refined carbohydrates like sugar, flour, fruit juice, and cereal products promote the persistently high insulin levels that lead to insulin resistance. Therefore, as counterintuitive as it sounds, the more sugar your diet contains, the harder it becomes for your brain to use it. High blood glucose and insulin levels are a deadly 1-2 punch for the brain. Repeatedly flooding the brain with too much glucose triggers unrelenting waves of inflammation and oxidative stress, damaging your brain's delicate architecture and overwhelming its mitochondria, the tiny engines inside your cells that work tirelessly to turn glucose into energy. Repeatedly bombarding the brain with too much insulin can lead to insulin resistance, which makes it increasingly difficult for insulin to enter the brain where it is needed to help turn that glucose into energy. The high glucose, low insulin brain struggles to generate the power it needs for peak performance, resulting in a slowly mounting brain energy crisis. The empowering news is that you can control your glucose and insulin levels yourself, and rather quickly too, simply by changing what you eat. The ketogenic diet is powerful metabolic medicine. Reimagining mental health disorders as metabolic disorders has opened the door to exciting new treatment approaches, the most powerful of which is the ketogenic diet. Ketogenic diets are very low carbohydrate, moderate protein, high fat diets that stimulate your body's ability to burn fat and to turn some of that fat into ketones, which your brain can burn for energy. For brains that have lost some of their ability to use glucose properly, ketones are a godsend because they help bridge the energy gap created by brain glucose processing problems. Some people think of the ketogenic diet as a weight loss diet, and yes, it can help you burn excess body fat. Some people think of the ketogenic diet as a diet for type 2 diabetes, and yes, It is a very effective way to treat type 2 diabetes because it reliably lowers blood glucose levels, reduces or eliminates the need for diabetes medications, and can even put type 2 diabetes into sustained remission. But did you know that the original intended purpose of the ketogenic diet was to stabilize brain chemistry? In 1921, long before anticonvulsant medications were available, the ketogenic diet was invented to treat children with epilepsy. More than a dozen quality clinical trials have since demonstrated that ketogenic diets are safe and effective in both children and adults with epilepsy, cutting seizure activity by more than half in more than 50% of cases, and completely eliminating seizures in 10% or more. The ketogenic diet has shown promise in many other neurological conditions as well, including multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and migraine headaches. This strong evidence base in neurology is good news for psychiatry, because as I see it, the line between neurology and psychiatry is imaginary. The brain isn't divided into neurology cells and psychiatry cells. It is one organ. It stands to reason that if a particular treatment benefits neurological brain disorders, it should also benefit psychiatric brain disorders. Emerging evidence looks very promising, and scientific interest in this area is suddenly exploding. Psychiatric conditions are neurological conditions. It's just that their symptoms were historically considered to be more psychological than biological. A powerful case in point is bipolar disorder, a serious mood disorder that includes periods of mania, unusually high energy, that are typically followed by periods of deep depression. Bipolar disorder and epilepsy share many common underlying features. In fact, many of the medications we prescribe to treat bipolar disorder are anti-seizure medications. If a ketogenic diet can stabilize seizures in people with epilepsy, it stands to reason that it may also stabilize mood swings in people with bipolar disorder. And this is the line of reasoning that led me to begin incorporating ketogenic diets into my clinical work more than 10 years ago. So, is the ketogenic diet the best diet for the brain? We could attempt to answer this question by testing ketogenic diets against Mediterranean diets, vegetarian diets, SAD diets, and the countless other dietary patterns one can imagine. But this would be a daunting proposition. So instead, let's take a step back and ask a different question. What does a brain-healthy diet need to accomplish? What is a brain-healthy diet? I propose that for any dietary pattern to be considered brain-healthy, it must fulfill all three of the following criteria. 1. It must nourish the brain by including adequate amounts of all essential nutrients. 2. It must protect the brain by excluding damaging ingredients. And 3. It must energize the brain in ways that support healthy metabolism for a lifetime by keeping blood sugar and insulin levels in a healthy range. These are the principles I used to create the dietary strategies I share with you in this book. And these very same principles apply to the rest of the body as well. All of our cells require the same nutritional care, which is fortunate, as eating a different diet for every organ we possess would be inconvenient, to say the least. The Mediterranean diet nourishes the brain better than the SAD diet, but it could be even more nutritious. It also protects the brain better than the SAD diet because it discourages ultra-processed foods and limits certain types of refined carbohydrate, but it could be even safer. Ketogenic diets reliably lower glucose and insulin levels, so they're very effective at addressing insulin resistance, and they excel at energizing the brain because they generate ketones that the brain can use as a supplemental fuel source, but their ability to nourish and protect the brain can vary tremendously depending on food choices. The quiet diet approach. The limitations of these dietary patterns led me to create 3 new dietary patterns for you to explore: quiet paleo, quiet keto, and quiet carnivore. I call these diets quiet because their food lists have been uniquely modified to target root causes of mental health conditions by quieting inflammation, oxidative stress, and high insulin levels. These plans are also lower in natural irritants and toxins and easier to digest than the standard paleo, keto, and carnivore diets you may already be familiar with, so they're much less likely to bother you if you have food sensitivities or poorly understood health conditions, such as chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and irritable bowel syndrome. Recognizing that not everybody wants or needs to adopt a ketogenic diet to improve their mental health symptoms, I'll show you how to figure out where you stand on the insulin resistance spectrum, help you customize your carbohydrate intake to your metabolic needs, and present you with a variety of other brain-healthy changes to choose from. Quiet Paleo. Like standard paleo, this plan allows meat, seafood, poultry, eggs, fruits, and vegetables, and excludes grains, legumes, dairy, refined carbohydrates, alcohol, vegetable oils, and ultra-processed foods. These excluded foods jeopardize brain health by interfering with nutrient access, disrupting energy flow, and promoting inflammation and oxidative stress. However, a key difference is that Quiet Paleo limits plant foods to a special list of what I call kinder, gentler fruits and vegetables that are not only lower in sugar, but also lower in the chemicals that plants use to protect themselves from predators. Quiet Keto. Like all ketogenic diets, this plan is very low in carbohydrate, moderate in protein, and high in fat, but Quiet Keto is based on the Quiet Paleo food list, minus the higher carbohydrate fruits and vegetables. So it combines nutritional quality with metabolic quality, giving you the best of both worlds. Quiet Carnivore. Like most carnivore diets, this plan is plant-free and therefore free of plant toxins, but Quiet Carnivore also discourages common animal food sensitivity culprits like eggs, dairy, and processed meats. Quiet Carnivore can be particularly helpful if you have unrecognized food sensitivities, gut damage, autoimmune conditions, and other stubborn or mysterious syndromes that haven't responded to other dietary interventions. After the initial discovery phase, if you find that your mental health has improved on one of these plans, you can then try expanding your food list to find the least restrictive and most enjoyable diet you can tolerate. Change your diet, change your mind. It breaks my heart to see people struggling with mental health problems who have tried a dozen or more medications or years of psychotherapy, but have never tried changing their diet in any way. Or worse yet, to see people faithfully following what they've been told is a brain-healthy diet of whole grains, legumes, non-fat dairy, blueberries, dark chocolate, and red wine, yet continuing to feel depressed, confused, anxious, or unstable, believing they're already doing all they can when there is so much more they can do. Whether you are dealing with a serious mental illness like schizophrenia, or an everyday mental health concern like irritability, I want you to know there is hope. We have been fed the wrong information about nutrition for decades, which means that most of us have been feeding our brains improperly for our entire lives and have no idea how much better we could feel if we ate right. Changing your mind with diet requires changing your mind about diet. And the first step on that journey is to clear your mind of any preconceived notions you may have about food so we can start fresh. Let's take a closer look at where mainstream beliefs about nutrition come from so you can decide for yourself if they are deserving of public trust.